My parents forced me to drop out of college and work 3 grueling minimum wage jobs just to pay for my golden child sister to go to law school. My own father looked me directly in the eye, took a sip of his vintage champagne, and told me I was nothing but a cash cow born to fund her genius. 5 years later, I was sitting in the very back row of a federal courtroom, dressed in a plain navy sweater, watching that exact same sister stand up in her pristine $3,000 Chanel suit to argue her very first multi-million-dollar corporate trial. She opened her mouth to deliver her opening statement, but before a single word could come out, the most feared judge in New York District Court stopped the entire trial, pointed directly at me in the back row, and said over the microphone, "Miss Bennett, would you like to join me in chambers?" And in that exact second, my arrogant sister, her corporate lawyer husband, and my cruel parents completely stopped breathing. "Miss Bennett, would you like to join me in chambers?" Honorable Judge Evelyn Roth said those exact words into the completely silent microphone of courtroom 302. She did not look at my sister Chloe. Chloe was standing rigidly at the plaintiff table, her shoulders pulled back, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the polished mahogany podium. Chloe had spent her entire privileged life preparing for this exact moment. She had practiced her authoritative tone in the mirror, perfected her posture, and invited our entire family to watch her prove that she was the brilliant legal prodigy they always claimed she was. But Judge Roth did not even glance at her. Judge Roth looked directly over Chloe's perfectly styled blonde hair, looked past the heavy wooden divider that separates the wealthy lawyers from the general public, and locked eyes entirely with me. I was sitting in the very back row of the public gallery. I was wearing a simple navy blue turtleneck and a pair of dark tailored slacks. I was not a lawyer. According to my family, I was a complete and utter failure. I was a college dropout. I was a former diner waitress. I was a ghost they only ever acknowledged when they needed someone to foot a massive bill or take the blame for an inconvenience. The silence that followed the judge's question was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck all the oxygen right out of the massive room. It is a very specific, terrifying kind of silence when the natural order of a room is suddenly and violently overturned. My father was sitting 2 rows ahead of me in the gallery. He had been leaning forward all morning, practically glowing with pride for his golden child. When he heard the judge call my last name and saw her looking at me, he turned his head around to look at me so fast, I genuinely thought his neck might snap. His face went completely slack. The smug, self-satisfied smile he had worn since we entered the federal courthouse melted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated confusion and panic. Sitting right next to him was Chloe's husband, Marcus. Marcus Sterling was a junior partner at a top-tier Manhattan law firm. He was a brilliant, fiercely arrogant African-American corporate lawyer who had spent the last 3 years treating me like I was the family maid. Marcus wore custom-tailored Italian suits, carried himself like he owned every single room he walked into, and never missed an opportunity to make a subtle, cruel joke about my lack of a college degree. When Judge Roth spoke directly to me, Marcus literally dropped his solid gold fountain pen. I watched it slip from his fingers. I heard it hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing clack that bounced off the high wood-paneled walls. Down at the plaintiff table, Chloe looked like someone had just slapped her directly across the face. Her mouth was slightly open. Her hands were gripping the edges of the wooden podium so hard her knuckles were turning completely white. She looked from the judge, back to the gallery, and then back to the judge again. She was completely unable to process why the most feared federal judge in the entire district was interrupting her shining, triumphant moment to speak to her deadbeat sister. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I did not give any of them the satisfaction of seeing a single ounce of emotion on my face whatsoever. I simply picked up my black leather portfolio, stood up from the hard wooden bench, and walked slowly down the center aisle. I walked past my father, whose mouth was still hanging open in shock. I walked past Marcus, who was staring at me like I was a ghost that had just materialized in the middle of a sunny day. I pushed open the heavy, swinging wooden gate that separates the gallery from the legal floor, walked right past my trembling sister, and followed the armed bailiff into the judge's private chambers. But to understand exactly why a $30 million corporate trial was just brought to a grinding halt for a college dropout, and to understand the absolute legal slaughterhouse that was waiting for my sister on the other side of that heavy oak door, I need to take you back. I need to take you back exactly 5 years, back to the very day I stopped being a daughter and officially became a checking account. 5 years ago, I was 20 years old. I was exactly halfway through my pre-law degree at New York University. I was maintaining a perfect 4.0 grade point average, studying in the university library until my eyes bled, and dreaming of the day I would finally walk across the graduation stage and hand my parents my diploma. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I was smart enough, and if I never caused any trouble, they would finally look at me the exact same way they looked at Chloe. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I went to the university bursar office to register for the upcoming fall semester. The clerk behind the thick glass window typed my student identification number into her computer, frowned deeply, and handed me a printed piece of paper. It was a formal notice from the bank. The tuition check my parents had written for my semester had bounced. The account had been completely closed without any warning. I took the train back to my parents' house in Westchester in a state of quiet panic. Their house was a massive, beautiful estate with perfectly manicured green lawns and a huge wraparound porch. It was the exact kind of house that projects massive stability, wealth, and success to all the surrounding neighbors. I walked through the heavy mahogany front door and immediately heard loud, joyful laughter coming from the kitchen. I walked into the kitchen, holding the bounced tuition check tightly in my shaking hand. The kitchen countertops were imported Italian marble. The bright afternoon sun was streaming beautifully through the large bay windows. My father was standing by the massive center island, popping the cork on a very expensive bottle of vintage champagne. My mother was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her tablet with a bright, genuine smile on her face. Chloe was sitting on a high velvet bar stool, clapping her hands together in pure delight. Chloe had just been accepted into an elite, astronomically expensive private law preparation program in the city. It was an exclusive fast-track pipeline designed to get wealthy students into top-tier Ivy League law schools, and the tuition cost more than most regular people make in 2 full years of hard labor. I walked over and set the bounced tuition check down on the marble island. The thin paper made a very soft sound, but it was enough to completely stop the family celebration. My father looked down at the check, then looked up at me, completely unbothered by the fact that my entire education had just been canceled. He calmly poured the bubbling champagne into 3 tall crystal flutes. He did not pour a 4th glass for me. "We have reallocated the college fund, Maya," my mother said. She did not even bother to look up from her glowing tablet screen. Her tone was casual, light, and totally dismissive, the exact way someone might mention that they decided to change brands of laundry detergent at the grocery store. Chloe's new program is incredibly demanding. She needs to live in the city, close to the campus, in a highly secure luxury building. She absolutely cannot be distracted by taking out student loans or working exhausting part-time jobs. Her brilliant mind needs to be completely focused on studying the law. I stood there, feeling the solid floor drop entirely out from underneath my feet. I asked them how I was supposed to finish my degree. I reminded them that I was already 2 years in. I reminded them that I was at the very top of my class. I told them I just needed the basic tuition money they had promised me since I was a little child. My father slowly picked up his crystal champagne flute. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch out to make me feel as small as possible. He looked at me with eyes as cold and unyielding as a steel bank vault. He did not look like a loving father looking at his youngest child. He looked exactly like a ruthless corporate investor evaluating a failing, useless asset. "You are going to get a job, Maya," he said, his voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. 3 jobs, if you have to. You are just the cash cow. Chloe is the real achiever here. She has the pedigree. She has the presence. She has the natural talent. We have a limited amount of capital in this family, and as a family, we have to back the winning horse. It is just simple economics. Do not be selfish and make this about you. He then calmly told me to go upstairs and pack my things. He said my bedroom was actively being converted into a spacious home office for Chloe, so she would have a quiet, comfortable place to study when she visited on the weekends. I was 20 years old. I had done every single thing right. I had never been in trouble. I had never asked for designer clothes or expensive vacations. I had just studied in silence and tried to be a good daughter. And in one single afternoon, I was evicted from my own life and stripped of my future, just because my sister needed a more expensive stepping stone to fuel her ego. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw things across the beautiful kitchen. My mother had taught me very early on that showing any negative emotion was a massive weakness they would simply use against me to prove I was unstable. I turned around, walked slowly up the carpeted stairs to the bedroom that was no longer legally mine, and packed all of my clothes into 2 cheap canvas suitcases. I carried them down the stairs and left the house before they even finished drinking their first glass of champagne. That very night, I moved into a tiny, drafty, studio apartment in the cheapest part of Queens. The old metal radiator clanked loudly all night long. The single window looked out at a dirty brick wall, and the cheap wooden floorboards were peeling away from the corners. It was a massive, jarring reality check, a far cry from the manicured lawns and marble countertops of my childhood in Westchester. The very next morning, I hit the pavement and started looking for any work I could find. I took a grueling morning shift waitressing at a busy, greasy diner, coming home every afternoon smelling constantly of burnt coffee and harsh chemical bleach. In the afternoons, I worked as a low-level legal courier, running court subpoenas across the busy city, getting heavy doors slammed directly in my face by angry, screaming people. And for the exhausting night shift, I found a mind-numbing job doing raw data entry for a massive corporate law firm deep in Lower Manhattan. I slept maybe 4 hours a night if I was lucky. My hands were always calloused and dry, my feet were always swollen and aching, and my bank account was constantly drained because my parents never actually stopped calling me. Every single month, exactly like clockwork, they demanded financial contributions for Chloe's expensive living habits. They called it my mandatory family duty. They told me repeatedly that since I was clearly not going to make anything of myself, the absolute least I could do was financially support the sister who actually would. I essentially became a ghost. I disappeared entirely into the background of my own life, exhausted, invisible, serving cheap coffee to rude strangers and typing mindless numbers into endless spreadsheets, while my sister bought expensive designer handbags with the money I literally bled for. They truly thought they had broken me. They thought they had permanently assigned me to the absolute bottom of the food chain, forcing me into a life of quiet servitude. But they had absolutely no idea what I was actually doing during those long, quiet, lonely night shifts at the corporate law firm. They had no idea that while I was silently typing their endless data, I was secretly learning the deep, hidden digital architecture of their lies. And they had absolutely no idea that forcing me to drop out of college and putting me in that specific data entry room was the most lucrative, incredibly destructive mistake they would ever make in their entire lives. For 2 grueling years, my life was measured entirely in minimum wage hours and demanded bank transfers. I woke up at 4 a.m. every single day in my freezing Queens apartment. I would put on my stiff polyester diner uniform, tie my hair back tightly, and spend 6 exhausting hours serving greasy eggs and refilling endless cups of cheap black coffee for people who never even bothered to look me in the eye. By noon, I was on the subway heading into Manhattan, carrying a thick leather satchel full of heavy legal subpoenas. Being a process server is a brutal and thankless job. You spend your afternoons tracking down desperate people who do not want to be found, standing in the freezing rain outside luxury apartment buildings, getting screamed at by angry executives when you finally hand them their mandatory court summons. It thickened my skin immensely. It taught me exactly how to read people, how to anticipate their lies, and how to remain completely expressionless when a grown man is screaming insults directly into your face. And every single week, without fail, my phone would ring. It was never my parents calling to ask how I was doing or if I was eating enough. It was always my mother or my father firmly demanding my hard-earned wages. Chloe needed $2,000 for a specialized bar review course. Chloe needed $1,500 to split the cost of a luxury summer rental in the Hamptons because networking with her wealthy classmates was absolutely essential for her future legal career. I sent the money every single time. I did not argue, I did not fight or beg for them to stop. I just worked my multiple shifts, deposited my small cash tips, and transferred the funds, building a silent and meticulous digital record of every single dollar they drained from my bank account. The true toxic dynamic of my new role in the family became glaringly obvious during a mandatory Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Westchester. I had just finished a brutal double shift at the diner. I was bone-tired, my feet were throbbing in my worn-out shoes, and I smelled faintly of industrial dish soap and fried food. I walked into the formal dining room and saw a brand-new face sitting confidently next to my sister. His name was Marcus Sterling. Marcus was a highly successful African-American junior partner at a notoriously prestigious corporate law firm in Manhattan. He was flawlessly handsome, impeccably groomed, and radiated the specific kind of aggressive arrogance that comes from never being told no in your entire adult life. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal gray suit that cost more than my entire car, a vintage gold Rolex watch, and a sharp smile that did not quite reach his cold and calculating eyes. When I walked into the dining room wearing my faded jeans and a cheap sweater, Marcus slowly looked me up and down like I was a piece of trash that had blown in through the front door. He leaned back comfortably in his velvet dining chair, swirled his expensive red wine in his glass, and let out a soft and highly patronizing chuckle. "So, this is the legendary sister who helps out around town," he said, his deep voice dripping with heavy condescension. How incredibly quaint. Chloe laughed a high, nervous, eager sound, clearly desperate to please him. She quickly told him all about my minimum wage diner job, completely omitting the highly relevant fact that my diner job was currently paying for the very designer silk dress she was sitting in. Later that evening, as the expensive dinner plates were being cleared away by the private catering staff my parents had hired, my mother cornered me in the dark hallway. She held out her perfectly manicured hand and casually reminded me that Chloe needed her semester textbook funds immediately. I reached into my cheap bag, pulled out my heavily worn checkbook, and wrote a check for $2,500. I handed it over to her in complete silence. Marcus happened to walk out of the dining room at that exact moment. He looked down at the large check resting in my mother's hand, then looked up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You really should be careful with optics, Chloe," Marcus called out, smirking openly as he slowly adjusted his expensive silk tie. "You do not want the State Bar Association finding out your promising legal career is being actively funded by someone scraping by on minimum wage. It is a terribly embarrassing look for our firm." My parents actually laughed out loud at his cruel joke. My father chuckled warmly and patted Marcus heavily on the shoulder, completely validating the humiliating insult. That was the exact moment the very last string holding my familial loyalty together completely snapped in half. They did not just want to take my money. They actively enjoyed my public humiliation. It validated their twisted, comforting narrative that I was intellectually and socially inferior. I did not say a single word in response to the insult. I just buttoned my cheap winter coat, walked straight out the heavy front door, and headed to the subway station for my overnight shift. I let them laugh together in the warm house. I let them blindly believe they were completely untouchable. The overnight shift at the massive corporate law firm was a completely different world from the diner. From midnight to 8 in the morning, the towering glass building in the financial district was completely empty, except for the armed security guards, the quiet cleaning staff, and a small army of low-level data entry clerks, exactly like me. We were stationed in a windowless basement room filled with loud humming servers and towering stacks of cardboard banker boxes. Our job was incredibly tedious and physically draining. We had to manually scan, categorize, and input hundreds of thousands of pages of raw legal discovery into the massive digital database used by the firm. Most of the other clerks just blindly typed the numbers on the pages, listening to loud music in their headphones, completely eager to get the grueling shift over with. But I did not just type the numbers. I read every single word. I read every highly confidential corporate contract, every subpoenaed internal email chain, and every deliberately hidden financial disclosure. Over the months, I started to naturally notice complex patterns. I started to deeply understand the hidden digital architecture of multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuits. I quickly realized that the highly paid corporate lawyers upstairs rarely looked at the actual raw data themselves. They simply looked at the polished summaries prepared by their tired junior associates. And precisely because of that arrogance, they missed things. They missed crucial, damning details buried deep inside the dense digital files. We were currently processing discovery documents for a massive and highly publicized corporate fraud case. The lead prosecutor handling the case upstairs was a senior partner named Evelyn Roth. Evelyn Roth was an absolute living legend in the New York legal circuit. She was brilliant, utterly ruthless, and completely terrifying to every single defense attorney in the city. She was famous for completely destroying corrupt corporate executives on the witness stand and for never accepting a weak plea deal. It was a quiet Tuesday morning at exactly 3 o'clock. The basement data room was freezing cold and completely silent, except for the rhythmic, steady clicking of my computer keyboard. I was scanning a massive batch of complex financial spreadsheets submitted by the opposing defense team. It was literally thousands of rows of mindless, repetitive data designed to exhaust the reader. But my eyes caught something incredibly strange on the screen. I opened the advanced digital properties of the Excel file and looked closely at the hidden metadata. Metadata is the invisible digital footprint left behind by every single action taken on a computer system. It clearly shows exactly when a file was originally created, exactly who created it, and the precise exact second it was last modified. The wealthy defense team was officially claiming that a highly contested financial contract had been signed and legally finalized 3 full years ago, long before the alleged corporate fraud ever took place. But the deeply buried metadata string on cell D4, the exact specific cell containing the critical date of the contract, showed a modification timestamp from just 2 short weeks ago. It was a massive digital smoking gun. It was a tiny needle buried in a massive digital haystack that 10 highly paid, Ivy League-educated legal associates upstairs had completely and totally missed. I did not report my massive finding to my immediate basement supervisor. I knew from experience that they would just steal the discovery, take all the credit, and permanently bury my name. Instead, I printed the exact page of the metadata server log. I took a bright yellow sticky note, grabbed my black pen, and wrote a single, clear sentence. Look at the modification timestamp on cell D4 and compare it directly to the internal server log. I took the private elevator all the way up to the quiet executive floor, slipped quietly past the sleepy security desk, and left the printed paper directly in the dead center of Evelyn Roth's massive mahogany desk. The very next night, I arrived for my midnight shift exactly on time. I swiped my security badge, walked into the freezing basement data room, and completely froze in my tracks. Evelyn Roth was sitting directly in my cheap plastic swivel chair. She was wearing a sharp, impeccable black suit, holding my yellow sticky note in her hand and staring intently at the basement door. When she saw me walk into the room wearing my oversized faded sweater and worn-out canvas sneakers, she slowly stood up. She did not ask me where I went to college. She did not ask me for my professional resume or my background. She looked me dead in the eye and asked me in a terrifyingly calm voice, "How exactly did you find this discrepancy?" I did not stutter. I did not act nervous or intimidated by her massive presence. I walked over to the desk, booted up my computer monitor, and calmly explained the complex digital architecture of the corporate file system. I explained exactly how the arrogant defense team had cleverly tried to scrub the visible document clean, but had completely forgotten to wipe the underlying server history on the back end. Evelyn Roth listened to my entire technical explanation in absolute heavy silence. When I finally finished speaking, she looked at me for a very long, intense time. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed loudly above us in the silence. "You are completely wasting your life sitting in this basement as a data clerk," she finally said, her voice sharp and incredibly commanding. "These highly paid Ivy League associates upstairs spend 80 hours a week reading dense case law, but they do not know how to look at the actual structural bones of a lie. I urgently need someone who sees the deep structure of the deception. I need someone who perfectly understands the digital paper trail." That was the exact night my entire life changed trajectory forever. The most feared judge in the district quietly became my personal mentor. She did not waste time teaching me how to argue loudly in front of a jury. She taught me something far more valuable and dangerous. She taught me that the legal system is not actually about who speaks the loudest or who wears the most expensive designer suit. It is entirely about who silently controls the underlying paper trail. She showed me how to legally trace hidden offshore assets, how to legally uncover deleted corporate communications, and how to entirely weaponize digital data against arrogant liars. I realized in that basement that my sister Chloe was currently spending hundreds of thousands of my hard-earned dollars to learn how to put on a theatrical performance in a courtroom. But I was learning how to end the entire trial before the judge even walked into the room. And I decided right then and there in the freezing basement that I was never going back to a traditional college. I was going to silently build something much bigger, much more powerful, and completely in the shadows. I did not go back to college. Instead of paying exorbitant tuition to sit in a crowded university lecture hall and learn outdated legal theories, I took a completely different path entirely in the shadows. I spent every single remaining dollar I had to my name on highly specialized advanced digital forensic certifications. I spent endless months locked inside my freezing studio apartment in Queens, teaching myself highly complex data extraction techniques, encrypted server architecture, and advanced metadata analysis. Evelyn Roth quietly introduced me to a highly exclusive network of elite litigators who did not care if I had a shiny Ivy League diploma. They only cared that I could reliably find the digital bullets they desperately needed to completely destroy their wealthy opponents in federal court. By the time I turned 24 years old, I had officially, and very quietly, launched my own private consulting firm named Bennett Legal Solutions. I was not a licensed attorney. I was the absolute secret weapon that top-tier Manhattan lawyers hired when they needed to uncover a deeply buried corporate lie. I started aggressively charging $500 an hour for my specialized services, and within 6 months, my professional calendar was booked completely solid by some of the most powerful law firms in the entire country. But my family knew absolutely none of this. I deliberately chose to keep my massive success completely hidden from them. I kept living in the exact same drafty studio apartment in Queens. I kept driving my beat-up 15-year-old Honda that always made a terrible grinding noise when I turned the steering wheel. I even intentionally kept picking up occasional weekend breakfast shifts at the greasy local diner, just to maintain the absolute flawless illusion that I was still a deeply struggling minimum wage worker. I knew exactly how my parents operated. If they ever found out I was suddenly making a massive 7-figure income, they would instantly, completely change their narrative. They would suddenly demand that I fund their lavish lifestyle, and they would brutally use their parental authority to try and legally drain my new corporate accounts. So, I remained a ghost. I let them blindly continue to believe that I was the absolute monumental failure of the Bennett family. The very first time I finally drew a hard, unyielding boundary with my entitled family was exactly 3 months before Chloe was scheduled to marry Marcus. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon. I was actually sitting behind the heavy mahogany desk in my brand new private corporate office in Midtown Manhattan, carefully reviewing a highly lucrative non-disclosure agreement for a new corporate client. My cheap personal cell phone suddenly vibrated on the desk. I looked down and saw my mother's name flashing on the cracked screen. I answered the phone and held it to my ear. My mother did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing, if I was healthy, or if I was eating properly. She immediately launched into a frantic, highly demanding tirade about imported white roses and luxury table centerpieces. She forcefully told me that the wedding budget had unexpectedly run over, and she urgently needed me to wire transfer exactly $15,000 to the event planner to cover the remaining floral arrangements. She explicitly stated that Marcus and his highly successful African-American family expected a certain elevated standard of luxury, and she said our family absolutely could not afford to look cheap and uncultured in front of his wealthy corporate relatives. I sat back slowly in my expensive leather office chair. I looked directly at my secure business bank account displayed on my glowing computer screen, which currently held just over $2 million in easily accessible liquid assets. I took a very slow, deep breath, and I spoke a single calm word into the phone. No. The line went completely dead silent. The silence stretched out for so long, I could actually hear my mother breathing heavily through the receiver. "Excuse me," she finally hissed, her voice dropping into a dangerous, highly venomous whisper. "You owe your sister this money, Maya. You completely dropped out of school and ruined your life, while she actually succeeded and secured a brilliant legal career. Do your mandatory part for this family and transfer the funds immediately." I did not raise my voice. I did not sound angry or bitter. I just kept my voice perfectly flat and professional. "My bank account is no longer open for your personal withdrawals," I replied calmly. "You and Dad will have to figure out how to pay for the imported flowers yourselves." And then I simply hung up the phone. Within exactly 1 hour, my personal phone buzzed again. It was a harsh text message from my father. It read, "You are a deeply selfish, utterly useless disappointment to this entire family. Do not even bother showing your face at the wedding if you cannot financially support your own sister." But I went to the wedding anyway. I went because I specifically wanted to sit in the room and see exactly who my family truly was when the free money finally stopped flowing into their pockets. The Sterling Bennett wedding was a massive $150,000 theatrical spectacle held at the incredibly iconic Plaza Hotel in the heart of Manhattan. I did not buy a new outfit. I wore a very simple, modest black dress I had bought off a cheap clearance rack 3 years ago. When I walked into the massive grand ballroom, I was immediately hit by the overwhelming, almost suffocating scent of thousands of imported white roses. Crystal chandeliers sparkled brightly overhead. A live string quartet played soft classical music in the corner, and waiters in crisp white tuxedos walked around carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. I walked over to the elegant silver seating chart displayed near the grand entrance to find my assigned table. I slowly scanned the names. I was obviously not seated at the main elevated family table with my proud parents, the glowing bride, and the wealthy Sterling family. I was not even seated with the extended relatives or the casual family friends. I was assigned to table 14. I walked slowly across the massive ballroom to find table 14. It was tucked completely out of sight behind a massive, thick marble structural pillar directly next to the loudly swinging kitchen doors. It was the designated vendor table. My parents had intentionally seated me next to the tired backup wedding photographer and the teenage coat check girl. It was a highly deliberate, calculated public insult designed to completely humiliate me and remind me of my exact lowly place in their social hierarchy. I calmly pulled out my chair, sat down behind the massive marble pillar, and asked the passing waiter for a glass of simple tap water. During the expensive 5-course dinner, Marcus finally stood up from the main table and confidently took the microphone to deliver his groom speech. He looked devastatingly sharp and incredibly powerful in his custom-tailored designer tuxedo. The entire ballroom went completely silent as he spoke. He praised Chloe heavily for her sheer brilliance, her recent difficult law school graduation, and her undeniable natural talent. He proudly announced to the entire wealthy room that she would officially be joining his highly prestigious corporate law firm as a first-year associate. The wealthy crowd clapped loudly. Then Marcus slowly lowered the microphone slightly, let a cruel, arrogant smirk spread across his handsome face, and looked directly across the massive ballroom toward my hidden table behind the pillar. He spoke smoothly into the microphone and said, "Chloe achieved all of this massive success through her pure intellect and high pedigree, unlike some people in this family who actively choose the path of least resistance and comfortably settle for absolute mediocrity." My father actually nodded his head in enthusiastic agreement for all the wealthy guests to see. Chloe let out a delicate, practiced laugh and playfully swatted her new husband on the arm. I just sat there perfectly still in the dark shadows of the pillar, slowly sipping my cheap ice water while they publicly mocked my entire existence. Suddenly, my cheap cell phone vibrated heavily inside my worn-out purse. I pulled it out under the table and looked at the glowing screen. It was an urgent, highly confidential email from the Senior Executive Council of a massive global technology conglomerate based in California. The email officially confirmed that Bennett Legal Solutions had just been formally retained as the lead digital discovery consultants on a highly complex, fiercely contested $50 million corporate espionage case. The initial required retainer fee that had just been wired directly into my corporate account for that single case was significantly larger than the entire astronomical cost of the extravagant wedding happening all around me. I slowly locked my phone screen, put it back into my cheap purse, looked directly at Marcus, standing arrogantly on the brightly lit stage, smiled very softly to myself in the dark, and took another slow sip of my water. I knew with absolute certainty that their massive, fragile egos were entirely built on a foundation of lies, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a lie. Fast forward to exactly 2 weeks before the disastrous events in the federal courtroom. I was now 27 years old. My private consulting firm, Bennett Legal Solutions, had quietly expanded from a single, cheap laptop in my drafty Queens apartment to an entire sleek glass floor in a highly secure corporate high-rise in Lower Manhattan. I completely owned the company. I employed 24 highly specialized digital forensic analysts, and my personal net worth had quietly surpassed 8 figures. I no longer drove the beat-up Honda, but I still kept it parked in a rented garage specifically to drive to my parents' house in Westchester. I maintained the carefully constructed illusion of my absolute failure, because it was the incredibly secure fortress that completely protected my peace and my wealth. My mother had aggressively demanded my mandatory attendance at a Sunday family dinner. She sent me a highly condescending text message stating that Chloe had incredibly massive news to share and that I needed to show up to properly support my successful sister. I drove the old, noisy Honda up the familiar, long driveway, parked far away from Marcus and his gleaming, brand new, incredibly expensive, imported sports car, and walked up the front steps. When I walked into the formal dining room, the heavy air smelled richly of expensive roasted lamb, garlic, and heavy imported red wine. The massive mahogany table was set with the fine family china and heavy polished silver. Chloe was sitting at the absolute head of the table, completely holding court like a reigning queen. She was wearing a pristine cashmere sweater and holding a crystal wine glass. Marcus was sitting directly next to her, looking incredibly smug and deeply satisfied. My father was carving the expensive roast, beaming with absolute, unfiltered pride. Chloe had finally been handed her very first major solo case at Marcus and his prestigious corporate firm. It was a highly complex, multi-million-dollar commercial real estate contract dispute, and she was representing the incredibly wealthy plaintiff. I quietly took my assigned seat at the very far end of the long table, right next to the kitchen door. I poured myself a glass of plain tap water and simply listened to her talk. She would not stop aggressively bragging. "The opposing legal counsel is completely and utterly terrified of me," Chloe boasted loudly, casually waving her heavy silver fork in the air to emphasize her massive self-importance. "They are just a tiny, pathetic boutique law firm. I am going to absolutely crush them in the initial discovery phase. The senior partners at my firm are already incredibly impressed with my aggressive legal strategy. Marcus even said my preliminary document filings were completely flawless." Marcus took a slow sip of his expensive wine, smiled proudly at his wife, and nodded his head in deep agreement. "She has a natural killer instinct in the courtroom," Marcus said, looking directly at my father for absolute validation. "She completely cornered the defense team with her initial evidence submissions. It is going to be a massive, highly publicized, total legal slaughter. Our firm is going to make an absolute fortune on the final settlement." My father raised his crystal glass in a proud toast. "To my brilliant, beautiful daughter," he said warmly, "the absolute winning horse of this family. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness, Chloe. You have the exact, perfect pedigree." Chloe practically glowed under their heavy shower of endless praise. She took a delicate sip of her wine, set the glass down, and then looked all the way down the long table directly at me. Her warm smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, highly calculating smirk. She looked at my simple, plain sweater and let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "Maya, since you completely ruined the floral budget at my beautiful wedding 3 years ago and deeply embarrassed this entire family, I've decided to let you make it up to me," Chloe said casually, as if she were doing me a massive personal favor. "I need a brand new victory outfit for the opening day of my massive trial. I saw a stunning, perfectly tailored white Chanel suit yesterday. It only costs $3,000. I expect you to pick up some extra overnight shifts at whatever sad diner you are currently working at and buy it for me by next Friday. Consider it a mandatory investment in your highly successful sister's future." I did not react to her massive financial demand. I did not blink, and I did not show a single ounce of anger. I just calmly picked up my plain water glass, took a very slow sip, and asked her a simple, completely neutral question. "Who exactly is the opposing law firm you are fighting, Chloe?" I asked quietly. Chloe rolled her eyes heavily, clearly deeply annoyed that a lowly waitress was daring to ask her about complex corporate legal matters. "It is a tiny firm called Harrison & Vance," she said highly dismissively. "Not that you would ever know who they are. They do not exactly tip the waitstaff at cheap diners." I completely stopped breathing for a fraction of a single second. I kept my face utterly blank and totally expressionless, but inside my mind, a massive alarm bell started ringing loudly. Harrison & Vance. They were not a tiny, pathetic boutique firm. They were one of the most incredibly ruthless, highly specialized corporate defense firms in the entire state of New York. More importantly, they were currently my single biggest corporate client. In fact, I was the designated lead digital forensic strategist on that exact commercial real estate case. I had spent the entire last 4 weeks meticulously tearing apart every single piece of digital evidence that Chloe and her arrogant legal team had proudly submitted to the federal court. And because I had personally read the highly encrypted raw files, I knew a massive, incredibly dangerous secret that my brilliant Ivy League sister did not know. I knew that her wealthy real estate developer client was completely lying. Her client had deliberately forged a massive chain of internal corporate emails to make it look like the opposing company had officially breached the multi-million-dollar contract. Chloe had eagerly taken the printed emails directly from her lying client and officially filed them into the permanent federal court record as Exhibit C. She was completely desperate for a fast, glamorous legal victory to impress Marcus and the senior partners. Because of her massive arrogance and her total lack of actual technical experience, she had not bothered to hire a forensic expert to to perform a basic routine metadata audit on the electronic files before submitting them to the terrifying federal judge. If she walked into that federal courtroom and formally presented those fabricated emails to the judge, she would be officially committing federal perjury by proxy. She would be instantly sanctioned, completely publicly humiliated, and she could very easily lose her prestigious legal license forever. I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, looking at my sister laughing loudly with her wealthy husband. I had a massive, life-altering moral choice to make. I could just sit there in total silence, drink my tap water, and let her blindly walk directly into an absolute legal slaughterhouse of her own making. Or I could choose to be the loving, protective older sister that this cruel family had never once deserved. I decided right then to give them one final, undeniable chance. I would offer them the complete truth. If they chose to reject it, their blood would be entirely on their own hands. The very next morning, at exactly 7 o'clock, I drove the noisy Honda back to my parents' massive estate in Westchester. The morning air was crisp and incredibly cold. I walked up the long stone pathway and found my father sitting comfortably on the large wraparound porch. He was wearing an expensive cashmere robe, drinking a freshly brewed cup of imported espresso, and slowly reading the morning edition of the Wall Street Journal. When he heard my footsteps on the wooden porch stairs, he lowered his newspaper and glared at me with deep, immediate annoyance. "What are you doing here so early, Maya?" he snapped harshly. "I told you not to come back to this house unless you had the $3,000 check for your sister's victory suit." I stopped at the top of the wooden stairs. I did not step any closer to him. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice incredibly level, serious, and totally devoid of any emotion, "you need to call Chloe immediately. You need to tell her to completely withdraw Exhibit C from her federal court filings right now." My father slowly folded his large newspaper and placed it on the small glass table. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of deep pity and absolute, total disgust. "What on earth are you blabbering about?" he asked, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Tell her to double-check the digital email timestamps on the submitted files," I said firmly, completely ignoring his cruel tone. "The raw server logs absolutely do not match the printed dates on the physical paper. Her wealthy client totally fabricated those corporate emails after the dispute started. If she stands up in federal court and submits that fake document into the official record, she is committing perjury by proxy. She will be heavily sanctioned by the federal judge, and she will lose her entire legal career before it even begins." My father just stared at me in complete, heavy silence for 10 long seconds. Then he threw his head back and actually laughed. It was a loud, cruel, highly mocking laugh that echoed across the massive, manicured front lawn. He stood up from his comfortable chair, pulled his expensive cashmere robe tightly around his waist, and walked directly up to me. "Are you completely out of your tiny mind?" he sneered, pointing a thick finger directly at my chest. "You are a failing waitress, Maya. You are a low-level process server who drops off paperwork for actual important people. You do not know the very first thing about complex corporate law or federal court procedures." "It is not complex legal jargon, Dad," I pleaded, trying one single last time to break through his massive wall of blinding arrogance. "It is basic digital forensics. The metadata on the files is completely fake. The defense team absolutely knows it. They are just waiting for her to step into the courtroom so they can completely destroy her on the permanent legal record. Just pick up your phone and tell her to audit the raw digital files." My father stepped even closer to me, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Are you really so deeply, pathetically jealous of your successful sister that you are standing on my front porch making up fake technical words just to try and deliberately sabotage her very first big case?" he screamed, his voice echoing loudly in the cold morning air. "You are an absolute disgrace to the Bennett family name. You could not cut it in a real university, so you dropped out and became a total failure. And now you are trying to drag Chloe down to your miserable, pathetic level." He pointed his finger directly toward the long stone driveway. "Get off my property right this exact second," he ordered fiercely. "And do not you ever dare show your bitter, jealous face at her federal trial next week unless you are holding a certified check to pay for her suit." I stood perfectly still on the wooden porch for one final moment. I looked deeply into his angry, arrogant eyes. I realized in that exact specific second that he did not just prefer Chloe over me. He actively, desperately needed me to be a complete failure so his entire twisted worldview made logical sense. If I was right and Chloe was wrong, his entire carefully constructed reality would completely collapse. I did not argue with him anymore. I did not shed a single tear. I just nodded my head once, completely swallowed the very last shred of empathy and familial love I had left in my entire body, and turned my back on him forever. I walked slowly down the long stone pathway, got into my old car, and drove away from the massive estate. I had officially delivered the crucial warning. They had completely rejected it. The massive steel trap was now permanently set, locked, and fully loaded. I just had to wait exactly 2 weeks to watch it snap completely shut. Which brings us directly back to the terrifying present moment inside the highly secure private chambers of Judge Evelyn Roth. The heavy oak door clicked completely shut behind me, instantly muting the loud, shocked murmurs of the crowded courtroom outside. The judge's private office was completely quiet, smelling faintly of old leather-bound law books and freshly brewed dark roast coffee. Judge Roth slowly took off her heavy black judicial robe, draped it neatly over the back of her expensive leather chair, and walked over to a small silver coffee pot sitting on a polished wooden side table. She poured 2 cups of steaming black coffee and silently handed one directly to me. She did not look at me the way my arrogant family looked at me. She did not see a college dropout or a pathetic diner waitress. She looked at me with deep professional respect, exactly the way a seasoned veteran looks at an incredibly highly skilled elite peer. "You look very well, Maya," she said calmly, leaning comfortably against the edge of her massive mahogany desk and taking a slow sip of her hot coffee. "You look incredibly intimidating today, Your Honor," I replied quietly, taking a sip from my own cup and holding her steady gaze. Judge Roth let out a very soft, tired sigh and slowly picked up a massive, thick manila folder from her perfectly organized desk. It was my sister's entire corporate case file. "The prestigious defense firm, Harrison & Vance, formally submitted your private forensic audit report to my court this morning under strict legal seal," she said, tapping her manicured finger directly on the thick stack of papers. "Your digital analysis is completely bulletproof, as it always is. Your sister's wealthy real estate client totally fabricated the internal corporate emails to cover up a massive financial breach of contract. And your incredibly eager, highly inexperienced sister blindly filed those fake documents directly into the permanent federal court record without performing a single basic digital metadata audit. She was incredibly desperate for a fast, glamorous legal victory to impress her wealthy new husband and his senior corporate partners," I said neutrally, feeling absolutely no sympathy whatsoever for the devastating legal train wreck that was currently sitting out in the courtroom. "She was incredibly professionally negligent," Judge Roth corrected me sharply, her eyes narrowing with absolute judicial fury. "I am going to have to heavily sanction her, Maya. I am legally obligated to formally refer her highly reckless actions directly to the State Legal Ethics Board for a massive, comprehensive review. She committed federal perjury by proxy because she wanted to play dress-up in a federal courtroom instead of actually doing the grueling, boring investigative work. I only called you into my private chambers because I saw the last name Bennett on the official case docket, saw you sitting quietly in the back of my public gallery, and quickly put the obvious puzzle pieces together. I wanted to give you a personal, professional heads up before I go back out there and completely tear her entire legal career apart on the permanent public record." I looked at the brilliant, terrifying woman who had generously taught me how to clearly see the deeply hidden digital bones of a corporate lie 5 years ago in a freezing basement. "Do your absolute worst, Your Honor," I told her calmly, setting my coffee cup down on the wooden desk. I did my mandatory family duty. I specifically tried to warn them 2 weeks ago, but my father explicitly told me not to lecture a real lawyer. I am just here today to quietly watch the unyielding arithmetic of karma finally balance its massive debt. I turned around, opened the heavy oak door, and walked directly back out into the tense, completely silent courtroom. The heavy air in the massive room was thick with extreme, nervous anticipation. Every single eye in the crowded gallery heavily tracked my every movement as I walked slowly down the center aisle and calmly took my seat in the very back row. My family was staring at me with burning intensity. My father looked completely livid, his face red with barely suppressed rage that I was somehow interrupting his golden child's massive moment. Marcus looked visibly deeply unsettled, his arrogant posture slightly faltering as he completely failed to understand why a powerful federal judge was privately fraternizing with his broke, uneducated sister-in-law. Chloe was just nervously gripping her wooden podium, breathing heavily, completely desperate to get the confusing interruption over with so she could finally deliver her highly practiced, theatrical opening statement. Exactly 1 minute later, the heavy wooden door behind the judicial bench swung forcefully open. Judge Roth emerged, completely wrapped in her flowing black robes, projecting the absolute terrifying force of a massive incoming thunderstorm. Everyone in the crowded courtroom scrambled to stand up in absolute, total respect. Judge Roth took her elevated seat at the high wooden bench, picked up her heavy wooden gavel, and struck it once with a deafening, echoing crack that completely silenced the entire room. "Counsel, be seated immediately," Judge Roth barked forcefully into her microphone before Chloe could even open her mouth to speak a single, highly rehearsed word. "Ms. Bennett, before you attempt to read your opening statement to this federal court, I direct your immediate attention to the defense team's highly urgent supplemental legal filing. Specifically, the comprehensive forensic digital audit of your proudly submitted Exhibit C." Chloe looked completely frozen and incredibly confused. She nervously shuffled the thick stack of expensive paper notes on her polished mahogany podium. Down at the opposing defense table, the highly experienced lead senior attorney from Harrison and Vance confidently stood up and buttoned his expensive custom suit jacket. "Your Honor," the defense attorney said in a loud, incredibly clear and commanding voice, "the defense has absolutely and definitively proven that the plaintiff's crucial corporate emails were entirely fabricated post-dispute. The deeply hidden server metadata clearly shows the digital documents were maliciously manufactured exactly 3 weeks ago. We formally move for immediate, total dismissal of this entire fraudulent lawsuit. And we move for incredibly heavy professional sanctions against the plaintiff's entire legal counsel for actively submitting forged evidence into a federal court." Chloe completely panicked. All of her expensive, elite legal training instantly evaporated into thin air. She gripped the heavy wooden podium and leaned aggressively into her microphone. "That is absolutely impossible, Your Honor," she practically screamed, her voice cracking with deep, unadulterated terror. "We completely verified those documents with our wealthy client. They are totally authentic." "You verified absolutely nothing, Counselor," Judge Roth's massive voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, echoing loudly off the high wood-paneled walls like physical blows. "The digital server metadata clearly and undeniably shows the documents were maliciously created on a local hard drive exactly 21 days ago. Did you not bother to formally retain a certified digital forensic expert to authenticate your evidence before you blindly dragged a multi-million-dollar corporation into my federal courtroom?" Marcus suddenly leaped up from his seat in the public gallery, completely abandoning all standard court decorum in a desperate, frantic attempt to publicly save his highly prestigious law firm's incredibly valuable reputation. "Your Honor, my incredibly prestigious law firm completely stands by our highly skilled associate," Marcus shouted loudly across the large room. "Sit down and close your mouth immediately, Mr. Sterling," Judge Roth snapped aggressively, pointing a sharp, terrifying finger directly at his incredibly arrogant face. "You are absolutely not on the official record in this federal courtroom, and if you speak one more single word, I will have the armed bailiff hold you in direct criminal contempt of court and throw you in a holding cell." Marcus instantly dropped back into his hard wooden seat, his dark face turning a sickly shade of pale gray, completely emasculated and totally silenced in front of a massive crowd of his elite legal peers. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Roth continued, turning her absolute furious, unyielding glare directly back to my trembling, hyperventilating sister, "your total failure to conduct even the most basic standard due diligence is an absolute monumental embarrassment to this entire federal court. You have officially committed perjury by proxy. This entire fraudulent commercial case is immediately dismissed with extreme legal prejudice. A formal mandatory sanctions hearing against you and your entire law firm is officially set for next Friday morning. We are adjourned." Judge Roth struck her heavy wooden gavel one final, devastating time, completely destroying my sister's entire, highly expensive legal career in less than 4 total minutes. The busy hallway outside courtroom 302 felt exactly like the chaotic, bloody scene of a massive multi-car highway crash. Chloe was leaning heavily against the cold marble wall, sobbing completely hysterically, her expensive white Chanel suit totally ruined by her messy running makeup. Marcus was aggressively pacing back and forth across the polished marble floor, desperately dialing his expensive cell phone, frantically trying to reach his furious senior managing partners to aggressively distance himself from his own wife's incredibly massive, highly public legal failure. My parents looked exactly like they had both instantly aged 10 incredibly hard years. When I calmly walked through the heavy glass double doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the loud, chaotic hallway, my father instantly spotted me. He completely ignored his sobbing, devastated golden child and angrily marched directly toward me, his face a terrifying shade of dark purple. "What exact venomous lies did you maliciously whisper to that federal judge inside her private chambers?" he screamed loudly, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly an inch from my face. "Did you purposely poison her mind against your incredibly brilliant sister? You are a vindictive, deeply jealous, incredibly pathetic little waitress who just ruined your own family's massive success." Before he could even finish his incredibly toxic, highly delusional screaming rant, the heavy courtroom doors swung open again. The highly successful lead corporate defense attorney from Harrison and Vance confidently walked out into the chaotic hallway. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and wore a deeply satisfied, highly victorious smile. He completely ignored my screaming, irrational father. He completely ignored Marcus and my sobbing sister. He walked directly up to me in the middle of the crowded hallway, stopped respectfully, and firmly extended his hand. "Absolutely brilliant digital extraction strategy on the server audit. Boss," the highly paid elite attorney said loudly, his deep voice carrying clearly over the incredibly chaotic hallway noise. "Your private forensic firm completely saved our corporate client over $30 million today. We are formally sending the massive final retainer check directly to your corporate office this afternoon. It is always an absolute honor doing highly confidential business with Bennett Legal Solutions." The entire busy marble hallway instantly went completely, totally dead silent. Chloe completely stopped crying, her tear-soaked face frozen in absolute, utter shock. My father slowly lowered his shaking, angry finger, his mouth falling wide open as his tiny, fragile reality completely shattered into a million sharp pieces. Marcus completely stopped pacing. His expensive cell phone literally slipped from his sweaty hand and crashed loudly onto the hard marble floor. All of his Ivy League arrogance, all of his highly expensive, custom-tailored superiority simply evaporated completely into thin air. "Your firm," Marcus stammered weakly, staring directly at me with incredibly wide, terrified eyes, completely realizing for the very first time that he had spent the last 3 years brutally mocking the highly powerful chief executive officer of the absolute best digital forensic firm in the entire country. I looked calmly at my deeply stunned, entirely silent father. Then I looked at my utterly destroyed sister. And finally, I looked directly into the deeply terrified eyes of her incredibly arrogant husband. "I am absolutely not your pathetic little cash cow," I said, my voice incredibly quiet, perfectly steady, and totally impossible for any of them to ever ignore. "I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Bennett Legal Solutions. I actively handle the highly classified digital forensics for the absolute elite Manhattan corporate law firms you all desperately wish you were smart enough to work for. I specifically tried to warn you about the fake metadata on your porch 2 weeks ago, Dad, but you confidently told me not to lecture a real lawyer. I did not stand there and wait for a single pathetic apology. I absolutely knew with total certainty there would never actually be one anyway. They were far too deeply poisoned by their own massive, towering arrogance to ever admit they were completely wrong about my entire existence. I simply picked up my black leather portfolio, turned my back completely on the highly toxic family that had aggressively tried to violently erase me, and confidently walked directly out the heavy glass doors of the massive federal courthouse. I stepped out into the bright, freezing New York City air, slid comfortably into the quiet back seat of my waiting private black car, and instructed my driver to take me back to my corporate office. I had a massive, highly successful corporate empire to confidently run, and I officially had absolutely zero dead weight left holding me back. The absolute devastating fallout from the federal courtroom disaster arrived exactly like a massive, slow-moving freight train over the next 6 incredibly chaotic months. I did not have to lift a single finger to completely destroy any of them. I did not have to seek active revenge or yell or scream. I just sat quietly in my beautiful, highly secure glass office in Lower Manhattan and watched the absolute, unyielding consequences of their own massive arrogance systematically dismantle their entire, incredibly privileged lives, piece by broken piece. The very first massive domino to completely fall was Marcus. The incredibly prestigious corporate law firm he worked for was absolutely furious about the highly public, incredibly humiliating federal court disaster. Marcus was desperately trying to make senior partner that exact same year, but his wealthy senior managing directors immediately called him into a highly secure boardroom the very next morning. They completely stripped him of all his major corporate accounts. They explicitly told him his massive failure to properly supervise his own associate wife was an unforgivable legal liability that severely damaged the incredibly valuable reputation of their entire firm. Marcus did exactly what incredibly selfish, highly arrogant men always do when their comfortable, wealthy lifestyle is severely threatened by someone else. He completely turned his back on Chloe. Less than 48 hours after the disastrous federal trial, Marcus aggressively packed all of his expensive, custom-tailored Italian suits and moved entirely out of their massive, luxury Manhattan penthouse. He officially filed for a highly contested, incredibly bitter divorce by the very end of that exact same week. He absolutely refused to pay her any spousal support whatsoever, aggressively claiming her gross professional negligence had directly caused him massive personal and financial damages. Chloe was suddenly left entirely alone in an incredibly expensive, completely empty luxury apartment she absolutely could not afford to keep paying for without his massive corporate salary. The second massive, incredibly devastating blow came directly from the State Legal Ethics Board. Judge Evelyn Roth absolutely kept her terrifying, uncompromising promise to the federal court. She formally submitted a highly detailed, incredibly brutal judicial report outlining Chloe's massive ethical failure to properly authenticate fabricated corporate evidence. Chloe was officially summoned to a mandatory, highly public disciplinary hearing in front of a panel of extremely seasoned legal experts. She desperately tried to cry and aggressively play the innocent, confused victim, exactly like she always successfully did at our parents' house. She loudly blamed her wealthy real estate client for deliberately tricking her. She angrily blamed Marcus for not legally helping her review the highly complex digital documents. She even tried to aggressively blame me for deliberately and maliciously trapping her in a federal courtroom. The highly experienced Legal Ethics Board absolutely did not care about her heavily practiced, pathetic tears. They looked directly at the undeniable digital metadata evidence my private firm had completely legally extracted, and they officially and permanently revoked her highly prestigious legal license. Her massive, highly expensive legal education, the exact same Ivy League education my cruel parents had forcefully sacrificed my entire college degree to financially support, was now completely, utterly worthless. Chloe was officially a publicly disgraced former lawyer with absolutely zero personal income, massive mounting luxury credit card debt, and a highly public professional humiliation that meant no reputable corporate law firm in the entire country would ever hire her, even to answer their front desk telephones. But the absolute most satisfying, incredibly poetic financial collapse belonged entirely to my incredibly cruel, highly arrogant parents. I used my extensive professional corporate network to quietly run a completely legal, highly thorough background check on their current financial assets. What I found, deeply buried in the public banking records, was completely pathetic and incredibly predictable. My arrogant father had secretly taken out a massive, highly risky second mortgage on the beautiful Westchester family estate just to fund Chloe's astronomical law school tuition, her highly expensive private prep courses, and her lavish, incredibly unnecessary Plaza Hotel wedding. He had blindly treated her entire legal career exactly like a guaranteed winning lottery ticket, fully and arrogantly expecting her to eventually pay him back tenfold once she officially became a wealthy corporate partner at a massive Manhattan firm. But with Chloe officially permanently disbarred and going through a highly bitter, expensive divorce, the massive monthly mortgage payments completely stopped coming in. Exactly 4 months after the disastrous federal trial, the massive national bank officially initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on their beautiful, perfectly manicured Westchester estate. The incredibly proud, highly arrogant man who had explicitly looked me directly in the eye and called me a useless, pathetic cash cow was now completely legally bankrupt. I actually drove my sleek new private black car past the massive Westchester neighborhood one quiet Sunday afternoon just to completely verify the absolute truth for myself. I saw a cheap commercial moving truck parked directly in the long stone driveway. I saw my deeply exhausted, highly stressed parents personally carrying cheap cardboard boxes out of the massive mahogany front door because they could no longer afford to legally hire professional movers. The beautiful, imported Italian marble kitchen, where they had happily drank vintage champagne and completely destroyed my entire college education, was now officially owned entirely by the bank. Chloe had been forcefully evicted from her luxury Manhattan penthouse and was currently living back at home with them, deeply bitter, constantly screaming, and completely trapped in a massive financial nightmare entirely of their own collective making. My mother actually tried to call me exactly one time during their massive, highly public financial collapse. I was sitting comfortably in my private corner office overlooking the beautiful, sprawling Manhattan skyline when my personal cell phone suddenly buzzed loudly on my mahogany desk. I saw her highly familiar phone number flashing brightly on the glowing screen. I did not decline the incoming call. I simply let it go directly to my highly secure corporate voicemail system so I could legally record exactly what she desperately wanted to say. She left a highly frantic, incredibly desperate 3-minute voice message. She did not apologize for aggressively forcing me to drop out of my university. She did not apologize for treating me exactly like an absolute financial slave for years. She did not apologize for publicly humiliating me at the vendor table during the extravagant wedding. She just completely skipped over all of her massive, undeniable emotional abuse and went straight to desperately begging for my hard-earned money. She frantically told me through loud, heavy sobs that they were about to officially lose the beautiful family house to the aggressive bank. She explicitly demanded that I immediately wire transfer exactly $200,000 to their personal bank account to legally save the proud family name. She actually had the absolute incredible, totally blinding audacity to forcefully remind me that loyal family always violently supports each other in times of deep financial crisis. I listened to the entire pathetic, highly delusional voicemail while slowly sipping a hot cup of incredibly expensive dark roast coffee. Then I calmly leaned forward and pressed the digital delete button on my computer screen. I did not call her back to argue or scream. I did not send her a single solitary dollar from my massive corporate accounts. I simply, completely blocked her phone number, blocked my father's phone number, and blocked my disgraced sister's phone number. I then officially instructed the heavy, highly armed security desk at the front lobby of my corporate building to permanently deny them any physical entry if they ever desperately showed up uninvited. They had aggressively demanded that I completely, independently build my own life from absolute scratch. They had explicitly told me I was totally on my own. So I did exactly what they proudly asked me to do. I built an incredibly powerful, highly lucrative digital empire entirely without their help. And I intentionally built it with incredibly high, highly secure walls they could never possibly climb over. I am currently 28 years old. Bennett Legal Solutions recently signed an incredibly massive, highly exclusive consulting contract with the federal government to aggressively investigate highly complex corporate fraud across the entire Eastern Seaboard. I completely own a beautiful, highly modern luxury penthouse overlooking the green trees of Central Park. I no longer work exhausting, highly degrading double shifts at cheap, greasy diners. I no longer smell like burnt coffee and harsh industrial bleach. I no longer spend my highly valuable, incredibly expensive time desperately trying to win the impossible approval of toxic people who are absolutely committed to deeply misunderstanding my absolute massive value. I finally learned the exact same massive, highly valuable lesson that highly successful corporate lawyers spend decades trying to perfectly master. You never actually win a massive argument by simply screaming the loudest in a crowded room. You never win by desperately begging for basic human respect from incredibly toxic, highly narcissistic people who absolutely refuse to see you. You exclusively win by quietly gathering the absolute, undeniable truth, patiently building your undeniable financial and professional leverage in the dark shadows, and eventually letting the brutal, unyielding arithmetic of stark reality do absolutely all the heavy lifting for you. My highly arrogant parents aggressively bet their entire financial lives on what they blindly thought was the ultimate guaranteed winning horse. They just never actually realized they were entirely standing on the completely wrong side of the track. I want to leave you with 5 absolute truths I learned from surviving and completely dismantling my highly toxic family. Lesson 1. Blood is absolutely not an unconditional contract for respect. Just because people brought you into this world does not give them the undeniable right to completely destroy yours. You are always allowed to walk away from a burning house, even if your own family is the one proudly holding the matches. Lesson 2. Silence is an incredibly dangerous weapon when used correctly. While highly arrogant people are busy bragging loudly to anyone who will listen, you should be quietly gathering the undeniable facts. The absolute loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest. Lesson 3. True power does not ever need a flashy audience. My sister desperately needed a massive Plaza Hotel ballroom and expensive designer suits to feel important. I built a multi-million-dollar corporate empire wearing a cheap sweater in a freezing basement. Build your massive foundation in the dark where no one can actively sabotage you. Lesson 4. Never endlessly try to rescue people from the devastating consequences of their own blinding arrogance. I explicitly offered them the complete truth on that wooden porch. They violently rejected it. Letting the unyielding arithmetic of reality finally crush their massive egos was not revenge. It was just natural justice. Lesson 5. Your absolute inherent value is never determined by a traditional timeline or a very expensive piece of paper. Dropping out of college was the absolute best thing that ever happened to me because it forced me to intimately learn the real mechanics of the world instead of just reading about them. If you are currently sitting in the absolute dark right now, completely exhausted from funding someone else's massive ego, I want you to share this story with someone who desperately needs a harsh reminder of their own massive worth. And tell me in the comments down below, what is the absolute hardest boundary you have ever had to set with your own toxic family? I personally read every single one.